Welcome to the Thinking About Computers podcast, where we talk about thinking about computers. Our guest today, Natacha Crooks. Natacha is an assistant professor of computer science at UC Berkeley. She did her PhD at Cornell, studying distributed systems. She's won probably a lot of awards, at the very least the Best Dissertation Award for systems research. Also a Parisian.
Technically, I did my PhD at Texas.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I was about to
Sorry.
say, I'm offended that you didn't mention UT Austin.
Even though I spent 4 years at Cornell, so I guess it's fair.
Really? Wait, how long did you spend at UT Austin then?
2 years.
Okay, that's enough.
I love breakfast tacos. That's
okay, perfect. That's all we need. Breakfast tacos, queso. That's it.
It was long enough to make me addicted to breakfast tacos, so I feel like
Okay,
it did its job.
that's good.
How are the tacos in Ithaca?
Disappointing. But the tacos, I think, everywhere else are disappointing. Austin tacos have a special place in my heart.
Yeah, that is true. I didn't realize that Austin tacos were special until I left, and I was like, oh wow, what is everyone else doing? This sucks.
That's how I feel about Northeast pizza as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, West Coast has not figured it out.
Wow. Okay. Oh, I'll go. All right, cool. So you're a professor. How many years into professoring are you?
I got my PhD in 2019, so 5 years ago now. I spent a year at a company. And then I started in fall 2020, so I'm just finishing up my 4th year.
See. And of the 4 years, could you rank them in terms of enjoyment or stress?
There was a global pandemic during the first 2. And I can't quite tell whether that made it more or less stressful.
Oh.
Because I think the first year in July 2020, everything was on Zoom. Everything was just a little bit strange.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was just different. It wasn't stressful because it couldn't really be hectic. Because if everything was on Zoom. So, I don't know it hasn't felt particularly stressful. It's felt like a lot of work, but it hasn't felt particularly stressful. Wow, I think things have gone relatively okay from the start, neither fantastically well nor fantastically badly. Yeah, I've been lucky with students. Maybe I've been lucky with just no major catastrophes.
Yeah.
But it felt like a lot of work and tiring, but it hasn't felt stressful.
Wow. That was not at all the answer I expected. I've asked quite a few junior professors and just other professors how their first few years were. And I know a couple of people who just started their professorship, a year or 2 ago. It seemed like the overwhelming sentiment was grad school, best time of my life. Being a professor, incredibly stressful.
For me, it was completely flipped.
Really?
I found grad school a lot more stressful.
Huh.
Because I think grad school, you've got 1 or 2 things you're doing, and you are only doing those, and so all your eggs are in one basket if those work out or don't work out. So if you miss a deadline, you miss that deadline.
Right.
In systems, we don't have, or database, we don't have that many deadlines. It's getting better now, but that last OSDI paper that I got made or broke my career. Kind of, not quite, but it definitely changed the schools that interviewed me, so it felt extremely stressful.
Yeah.
Whereas now, rejections happen every month.
Right.
Acceptance happen. Maybe not quite every month, but at a high enough rate that it's a little bit lost in the wash, and so it's less intense. It's also you feel deadlines a bit differently. There's always deadlines, but no deadline is that important.
Yeah.
Or more important than everything else. So I've definitely felt PhD was a lot more stressful than professor life has been so far.
So why decide to become a professor if the PhD was very stressful? What was the thought process there? What else were you kind of considering?
One, I'm terrified of the Google interview process, and I'm not entirely sure I could write code live. That is a little bit of a reason, I'm not going to lie. No, I think it is nice to think about problems in the abstract, like to think about pros and cons in a way that you don't necessarily have time to do in industry, because you're working on actually getting the product built. And so I think I like that aspect. I like synthesizing things. I like thinking about abstractions, and I don't know that I could have done that in industry. I think the also more practical reason is that it is easier to go from academia into industry. It is harder to go from industry into academia. And so if you have options that you think are good in academia, then try that, see if you like it. Rather than just go the other way.
Yeah.
But honestly, if I'd had industry jobs that were interesting, like especially industrial research jobs, I would have also happily considered them.
Mm-hmm.
So were you considering academia from like the start of your PhD, or did it just,
I think maybe it's because that was 10 years ago now, or 12 years ago, or maybe that was because I was in England or in Europe. Just there's less of a pipeline into PhD. Like it's not 4 years of undergrad and you've got this whole like NFL, NBA like draft process.
Yeah.
All the things are standard. It just kind of happened ad hoc. Like I didn't really think about research until I saw this research internship position I could do in Germany, and I wanted to continue to improve my German. And so I did that.
Wait, you just did it to improve your German?
Yeah, that was the only reason. I never really thought about research, computer science. It's not something that you think of at undergrad in England.
Yeah.
There's no opportunities to do research. And so that internship just turned out to be one exclusively in English, so not helpful to improve my German, but like just the most fun I've had. And so then I started, according to my mentor at the time, applying for PhD. But then again, I just stayed, I was at Cambridge, I just stayed at Cambridge initially. And then my advisor left and then started a long series of advisors leaving, but it wasn't really a thought through process. It's just, okay, this was fun. Let me do a PhD.
Just off vibes. I'm just going for what's fun.
Yeah. And then it just kept going. I never really had a plan. Maybe I should have, but I didn't really had a plan. And then I think when it came to applying, it's okay, let's try this academic stuff and see where it goes, see how it works out.
So this advisor's leaving, or could you expand? Have you had more than one advisor leave?
Yes. I've had 3.
3?
Yeah, I wanted to do my PhD in 4 schools because of advisors disappearing or going to industry or moving universities.
Really?
I never had to restart the topic though. So I was very lucky in that even though it was chaotic from a life perspective, I think whenever they left, they made sure I was okay. And then I was able to continue working on the same stuff. So it probably meant I spent a year longer, I'd say in total, just from the shared time it takes to move.
Yeah.
So but it didn't impact, I didn't have to restart 4 times.
So how long was your PhD? And just walk me through the location, advisor time,
First year was at Cambridge in the UK, working with Steve Hand, who wound up leaving for Microsoft Research. So I moved to MPI in Germany with the person I'd been working with in undergrad, who I was still working with during my PhD. So I went to Germany for, I guess, a year and a half. He wound up leaving for Google. So I went to his advisor. I went one up to Texas, which is where I wound up being a visiting scholar for a year and then transitioning to full student for a year. And then he moved to Cornell after a couple of years at Texas. And so I wound up finishing the rest of my PhD at Texas. So
interesting.
So sorry, wound up finishing the rest of my PhD at Cornell. So I graduated from Texas.
So what's the process of your advisor moving from one university to another university?
Honestly, way more messy than it should be. I think universities, in my experience, aren't great at accommodating the fact that by the time you're doing your PhD, you're an adult.
Yeah.
Like this shouldn't be about grades or about like, you know, we all have different classes and requirements, roughly to ensure that people don't make a fool of themselves.
Right. Yeah.
But the reality is they're researchers, they're junior researchers or like mid-career researchers as a function of where they are in the PhD.
Yeah.
And I think schools tend to forget that when you're trying to transfer. One of the reasons I didn't transfer formally from Texas to Cornell is because Cornell has a requirement that you should stay for 3 years. And at the time I was more optimistic about my graduation timeline, but also they weren't sure they would transfer all the courses I'd taken in Texas because of some, you know, they didn't necessarily align. And so I think that is just a pain.
Yeah. It is strange. I have noticed just in general, I don't know if this is CS specific, but like, at least at Berkeley, I feel like, you know, my advisors and other students in, you know, the general department doesn't really view classes as like quite, you know, a large part of your PhD. And when I talk to people outside of the department, I think they view grad school like undergrad plus. Yeah. Like, yes. If you're transferring, you know, undergraduate institutions, those credits really gotta be 1-to-1. But it's strange to me that somehow people didn't get the memo that like grad school is not really like that. Yeah. But yeah. So were you physically at Cornell?
Yeah, I was physically at Cornell for 4 years.
So they allowed you to physically be at Cornell,
but stay a Texas student, which was fun for insurance purposes.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, I just did one. I also had funding, like I had the fellowship of some sort at Texas that allowed me to be there for 5 years. It was a 5-year fellowship. Benefits of restarting 3 years in. I still had a 5-year fellowship, and so it wasn't a problem to continue. But yeah, no. Texas was great, and they accommodated me in every possible way, which is also not the case for every school. Like they allowed me to fake take a class.
Oh,
like
really?
I took a class at Cornell and got a grade, and at some point they like forwarded on to Texas, and Texas was like, "Yeah, that is totally our database class.
Nice.
You got an A+. Wait, we don't do A+ as a Texas. You got an A."
Amazing.
But not all schools are like that, and I think it creates unnecessary friction when it's also hard on the advisor. Like, you take a student in year 1. Life can mean that you may not be there in year 6 for many reasons. Like committing 6 years in advance to where you're going to be.
Yeah.
I am not pretending I have any plans to leave in the next 6 years.
Yeah.
But I also acknowledge that life happens, family happens, partnerships,
right?
Parents of partners happen. Like there's many things that is a hard commitment to say, I am 100% definitely going to be in the same place in 7 years.
Yeah. That's something I've wondered about with like the academic career path, because in most jobs, like, you know, if something comes up and you need to move, you need to like change jobs. I mean, it's not ideal for the company, but like you're not leaving people hanging, I think, to the same extent that it is when you're like advising students and like need to leave for whatever reason. But like students take 5+ years to graduate. So like no one can plan that far ahead and like be like, oh, I'm going to pause taking students, wait 5 years and then like move or whatever. Yep. So, and is there, I don't know, how do you think about that? Is there like a good solution to that problem? Or
I mean, I think before I became faculty, I was like, yeah, no, this is just the advisor's responsibility. They should never take a student if they think. And I'm now realizing, well, should I pause my life for 5 years if I think there might be a chance that in 5 years I may? That's a lot of ifs.
Yeah.
I don't know. I do think schools should make it easier for people to transfer if they want, and let's treat it like a job. You know, like you did 3 years at Texas, then you do 3 years at Cornell. That still means you're a 6th year, as opposed to have to retake a bunch of classes because they're not the same or have these requirements about You should only, you graduate if you spend 2 years at that school.
Yeah.
I think Zoom has made it a lot easier. I think now we're a lot more comfortable with meeting over Zoom, and I suspect that hybrid is easier. So you could probably, let's say that I decided to move to Antarctica, I would still be able to hold my lab meeting.
Mm-hmm.
It will be less fun, less great, but I think that has made things easier over maybe even 5 years ago, where if your advisor moved and you stayed put, it was hard for.
Yeah.
But there's also other things like securing funding for the student who is still at the university when you're not at the university is a little bit of a challenge.
Mm.
So there's a few things I think we could smooth over if we acknowledge the reality that people do move.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously you hope that they're a good person and that they continue to meet with the student as if they hadn't moved. That's kind of a prerequisite.
Yeah.
But beyond that, the sort of admin overhead of, if I move to Antarctica, to the University of Antarctica, I may not be able to get funding for Berkeley, which would then in turn be difficult to fund my students.
Mm-hmm. So do you find, like, it seems like a lot of pressure to have, a fair amount of students that in some ways are kind of relying on you for their career or just for general like life advice. What are your thoughts on co-advising? Do you think that this takes some of the pressure off, or do you think this adds just further friction?
I think co-advising is great as long as the advisors are not systematically pulling the student one way or the other. Because I think that can be the difficulty.
Yeah.
And that can be because they have completely different interests and just don't care.
Yeah.
Or that can be just despite their best intent, they're subconsciously pulling the student.
Yeah.
I think there's different models of advising, right? You can have like the junior faculty doing 90% of the advising, but the senior faculty kind of looking over and giving more like broad stroke advice, or maybe stepping in for when when someone goes on the job market.
Yeah.
Or sort of broad stroke advice. I can see that working well, as long as the junior faculty is kind of okay sharing the credit with the senior faculty. Sometimes it can just be like very close collaborations, but I think that requires some maturity on the part of the student to get the best of both and not the worst of both.
Yeah.
Because advisors are strong at different things, but they're also weak at different things.
Right.
And you want to take the leverage the best, as opposed to just, well, they don't care, so I'm just not going to do this, even though they care.
Yeah, this is something that I struggle with. I often am like, one of them likes it, we're going to go with it.
Yeah. Seems like a very common failure mode for co-advised students is just getting kind of pulled two different ways. I'm like, how do you deal with that? Yeah.
I think part of it is your advisor is, at the end of the day, the person that you both most need to impress, but also least need to impress. So being brutally honest about what you're doing well, what you're not doing well, is probably the best strategy. So like if they're pulling you in two different directions and say, okay, you said this, he or she said this.
Yeah.
Guys, you need to stop.
Yeah.
I think most people want the best for the student. I mean, this applies to like advisors that mean well, not malicious advisors. That at that point, all bets are off. But I think it is a good, being ruthlessly honest with yourself and your advisor is probably a better strategy than trying to fake it out or trying to work it out on your own.
Yeah.
Because their career depends on yours too.
Right.
So forget about me caring about the people. I also need them to do well if I want tenure. I mean, I'm being facetious. But from a practical standpoint, I need my students to do well.
Right.
And if it's not working because of either bad co-advising or things, then like, we need to talk about it and figure out how to change it, right? Just from a purely selfish point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is something I've been wondering about advisors that, let me try to find a good way of phrasing it. Like, I don't want to say bad students, but you commit to a student for, 5-6 years, and you don't actually know them super well, likely, unless you've worked with them previously. And it could be that, your working styles are very different, or they end up really liking another direction, or, you don't, think that they're producing enough output or something. How do you, go about dealing with this? Maybe in a hypothetical, not to say that any of your students are like this or anything like that.
They mysteriously disappear in the dead of night,
Right.
never to be found again. I think two things, I think. One, I'm realizing that time is my most valuable resource.
Mm-hmm.
And if someone is really struggling for reasons that they're not, it's not right for them, or they're not putting in the work for whatever reason, it is less about the money that I'm spending,
Right.
more than the time I'm spending getting them from point A to point B. The other aspect is that if you're in a PhD program and you're not enjoying it, either because research is not for you, quite the example of a friend of mine who is pretty bad at research but outstanding engineer, and was pretty clear from early on that it wasn't going to be, PhD wasn't going to be for them. They're now making a fortune at a company and climbing up the ranks really quickly. There was no good reason for them to stay in the program.
Mm-hmm.
PhDs are the biggest sacrifice to do a PhD is on the student, right? Financially speaking.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it's not working because the research directions don't align, or because the student isn't strong at research,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to at whatever, building a company or as an engineer, I think it's good to try and have the conversations to say, hey, is this actually what you want?
Right.
Because research is a very unique skill, and not everyone is built that way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's good to have the opportunity to say, hey, I see you struggling. Is this actually what you want?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you want to go and make 5 times more money?
Yeah.
And at a company and probably be more successful than trying to trudge it out.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really replying to your question. I'm just trying to give I think when the student goes into a different direction, my worry with that is that I cannot be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a set of things that I just don't know much about, and there's also things that I'm not good at or that I find boring.
Right.
And I don't necessarily have enough time to learn the material. And then you're really on your own.
Right.
And I think that can be okay, but usually those PhDs work out less well because you get one less colleague.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's through trying to find a co-advisor, or whether it's through finding a collaborator somewhere else, that can work, but it's going to be a harder route.
Yeah.
And I don't know that PhD students necessarily appreciate that.
Yeah.
That it's going to be a harder route because you're just losing a colleague.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that we can brainstorm on something if we're working on we speak the same language. If we don't speak the same language, you've just lost a brainstorm partner who is required to talk to you 2 hours a week or however long it is.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm becoming more maybe aggressive in trying to say, hey, I don't want to work on this particular topic.
Yeah.
Not because I don't think it's good, but because I just don't have the bandwidth to actually learn about it.
Right.
So if you want to work on this, find a co-advisor, or you can, but you'll just be
right. Isolated.
Yeah.
Helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's not being selfish. That's just being a realist in terms of how much bandwidth I actually have to read the papers.
Yeah. So you mentioned time is a scarce resource as a professor. So what does like an actual day-to-day look like as a computer science professor? Where does the time get spent mostly?
Have you seen Joey's calendar?
It gives me like a wave of anxiety when I look at it.
So pretty much meetings. Like I'd say I'm probably in meetings most of the day. Gets a bit more quiet during holidays or during like off semester period.
How many of those are with like your students, and how many of those are, I don't know, funding related? Or
I'd say 70. I think teaching is about a third of related things. Other faculty admin maybe I'll include that in that third. And then it's like various, and it's mostly research meetings, then a few other meetings surrounding like service things.
Makes sense.
Let's see.
I'm curious how much time service sorts of stuff takes up, because that's something that you really don't see as a grad student unless you're in machine learning, where the grad students review all the papers. But at least in like systems and databases, you kind of don't see that side of the academic world.
To get on Friday, I have my first meeting at 8, and I have pretty much constant meetings. I don't have a meeting 8:30 to 9:30. That I pretty much have constant meetings, including seminars.
Wow, all that time.
Until 4:15. And I'm noticing I have 2 meetings at the same time at 3:30, so I need to handle that.
Right.
I think depends on how much you want to do. Like there are people who do very little, and there are people who do a lot. There are people who start doing a decent amount and then slowly taper off. And that's one of the issues I understand is present in both the systems and the DB community, that senior people don't necessarily review enough. So this puts pressure on the load for junior faculty. Right now I'm trying to do 2 or 3 PCs a year, so that's 20, 25 papers per PC, depending on the conference. And I do a bunch of other service stuff, and I think I probably do on the middle to high end amount of service. Not insane, but maybe a bit more than the average.
Yeah.
Also think if you're a woman in systems, you get asked to be on every single PC in DB, which is good, but also does mean that if you're not very careful about saying no, you're going to get to do a lot.
Yeah.
But you also get more opportunities, so it's you just have to be mindful about how often you say you say yes to things. But it's a good number of hours. I mean, reviewing 20 papers takes time.
Yeah.
The Sigma and Artifact stuff, evaluation chair, and that's going to take an hour a week for the next few weeks. Chairing HotOS took an hour a week for 6 months.
Yeah. Adds up.
Yeah. Like for writing an NSF proposal for the lab, that takes up an hour a week.
Yeah. I mean, so would you describe the job of being a professor as like a management role, in like the management versus the individual contributor kind of dichotomy?
I suspect many people will disagree, but I think yes, and I think we should have more training as managers as a result.
Yeah.
I think trying to have so many different hats is difficult, and I think sometimes being an explicit manager would actually be helpful, because you would receive the training as a manager, which you need to learn.
Yeah.
I mean, you do still actively participate in research, but if you think a manager of Microsoft Research, they also still do participate in research, just from a more higher level standpoint.
Yeah.
Do you ever miss actually doing the low level research part of it?
I think I don't necessarily miss the stress and having to like figure out a bug and being worried about the deadline.
Right.
But I do miss the feeling like I know everything there is to know about an area.
Yeah.
Because now, like for my students who are working in consistency, in transactions, I still feel like I can understand the material, like I know the background.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well enough that I feel comfortable talking about what they do. But for the students that are working on consensus, I haven't like gone through the pain of implementing all those things.
Yeah.
And so they know a lot. They're a lot more comfortable than me in that area. And that's great. That's how it should be. But it means that when I go to a conference, I feel like a first year again. Where like I'm a little scared of having a conversation with someone because like I know what we've done, but I haven't read all the like 15, 20 related works in like huge amount of detail.
Yeah.
Or like I don't understand the subtlety. And so it's a little scary to go to a conference and start talking about your paper, your work, and you're like, oh, but what if they ask me about this?
Right.
Do you feel like it's kind of like understood amongst professors that like there is a certain level of like needing to black box some things and not understand everything in all that detail?
I think so.
Yeah.
But I think the more senior you are, the more comfortable you become. I feel like I need to know everything. Because I've seen some of my more senior colleagues who are perfectly cool with understanding the sort of the high level.
Yeah.
So I do sometimes miss the like actually having to do the thinking myself and having to like, write the code myself and stuff.
No.
So when you were thinking about going into academia as a graduate student, was your picture of what it would look like day to day anything like what it ended up being?
I think broadly speaking, yes. Partly because my advisor was very good at sort of explaining to me what he did. I think he spent a lot of time both like showing me how grants worked, how the system worked, and so I felt like it wasn't a fairly smooth transition, which is nice. I didn't quite expect it to be like grad school is a very social experience. Like you're in the lab, like, even if you have friends outside, sort of social time and like work time sort of blends in.
Right.
And it's especially true, I think, during COVID, where we were in the lab most day, every day, just normally. And during deadlines, we'd stay late at night. And so often your social time was going to get dinner with your lab mates and coming back. And I know I like that. I think being faculty, because you're in meetings all the time, it's actually relatively hard to see other faculty. So you see your students, but you see them in sort of more narrow periods of time. So it's a lot more of a lonelier job than I anticipated. Because there's less of a just trying to get faculty for lunch.
Yeah.
Because we all have different calendars is really, really tough. Or for coffee or whatever it happens to be. So I think it's naturally you don't have a reason to talk to other faculty as much. Like if you're in a company, you talk to your team. And you talk to many people on your team all the time. Here, I'll talk to students, but I won't talk to other faculty.
Yeah.
A whole lot. So I think it's lonelier than I anticipated to be.
Yeah.
Interesting.
This is something I thought about a bit of like, it depends on, depends on where you work in a company, but if you work at a large enough company, like there's always going to be a fair amount of people who are, around your age in like the same stage of life as you, which is usually, easier than to make friends with people who are, in your same stage of life. Grad school, like this times 1,000, right? It's like you're just with everyone who's going through the same, sometimes stressful, sometimes great experience. But with faculty, because of this like tenure, like people tend to stay for a really long time, it seems like you get much less of this, of having, people that you work with closely that aren't, your students, sort of being in like your same stage of life and, like seem like good friend candidates.
I think I joined July 2020. So everything that the university could have done to welcome new faculty was cancelled. And then it was pretty much cancelled until 2022, by which point it was kind of almost too late. So I think the university does a lot to try and welcome new faculty through, like, we had a teaching excellence class through various sort of welcome induction events where you can meet other junior faculty. I think the department recently has started to try and make it a point of having like junior faculty dinners to try and encourage that kind of group cohesion, because there might not be a huge amount per year, but if you aggregate over 2 or 3 years and over like the entire department or the entire school, there is a decent group usually.
Okay.
So I know the junior faculty and I, like several of us, have a weekly survivor night. And yeah, this is someone with quantum computing and someone who works in ML and chemistry. So nothing to do with people I would ever work with.
Yeah.
But we kind of discovered our shared enjoyment of that through faculty lunch. So I think I missed out on a lot of junior faculty socialization because we didn't have that group. But I do think universities know that and try to like foster some of that, because in many ways it's a little bit like grad school. Yeah. You start in a new city with very little friends. Yeah. And you're going through a new thing that's relatively stressful and different from what you've done before. So there's no reason why it doesn't need it. You just don't see them on a daily basis.
Right.
Do you ever try to find a way to co-advise a student with your survivor friends, or like push towards a project? You're like, I've been thinking about chemistry recently, and
I'm sure that eventually this is not survivor, probably not, but too far. But I do think pre-COVID there was a lot more offhand conversations between faculty about what they were working on, which in turn would lead to maybe a project. I think now that happens less, and I think it would be good if we made a space for that again, of like the polite chit chat, whatever, survivor, or the many other things like lunch, coffee, where you start talking about someone. We're working on something similar. Why don't you join? I think that's important to foster. Because I do think that if you look at the past, a lot of people have had strange collaborations with people where you look at the story and it was like, well, we were trying to work on this thing. I met this person at the coffee machine and they told me I was doing it wrong. And so now we're collaborating.
Yeah. No, I had that. I had a collaboration with some people at Stanford because we were just randomly the computer vision department had planned a little day where we would go down and present some of our work. And I met someone and we had basically published the same paper at the same time and didn't know each other. And we're like, wow, seems like we're kind of aligned. And then it turned out we were currently working on the exact same thing. And we're like, wow, collaboration born. And that was just like a random one-off conversation. Yeah.
I think companies are maybe better at doing things like happy hours and organized fun. And I think sometimes academia doesn't spend enough time thinking about the meta aspects of where to sprinkle organized fun, where to sprinkle mandatory fun, when to sprinkle breaks in order for these things to sort of bubble.
Yeah. And I feel like the grad students are doing a lot of that stuff. It sounds like just the faculty at Berkeley are missing out.
Yeah, you guys need to kick it in gear. We've got it down.
We've been talking about writing a blog post about this sort of stuff, like how to build lab culture. Haven't gotten around to doing it. But
it's 60% done, but yeah, it's been in the draft since December.
I do think faculty are at a stage often where they have partners, they are starting to have kids. Not that grad students can't have partners or kids, but that does mean that does place a little bit of constraints on, and just the sheer number of meetings. That does place a couple of constraints.
Okay, so a little bit of a pivot, but I'm quite interested in, from what I understand, your PhD journey from an external person's point of view is you ended up publishing a very high impact paper, sort of somewhat not late in your PhD, but you didn't have like a flurry of papers that you wrote very early. It was more of a slow burn in your PhD. I've heard this from a couple of other faculty who've had this as well, of like, you know, I didn't publish that much, or I didn't publish as much as my peers. And then, you know, close to the end, I had something really high impact. I'm kind of curious on, first, if this is true, if spewing false information. Is it somewhat correct?
I honestly don't know. So it's
Nice.
true that my first author papers was Sigmod 2016, which is technically 4 years after I started. It got accepted like in 2015, but published. So it was my first author paper was pretty late on. I think in large part because I was working alone on it.
Yeah.
And I made every possible mistake. Like,
Sure.
on it. Because I moved also, I think I had to sort of change collaborators and whatnot. And then after that, things went a lot better in terms of what I published. I don't know if one of my papers was particularly high impact or not versus the others.
Oh, really? So after that first author paper in your third or fourth year, did you have a feeling of like, now I'm established? Or did you already have this?
I think the feeling that gave me that I was established is that I started knowing people at conferences. And at some point in 2017, people started viewing me as a core member of the community and says, oh, we know you're going to be applying for jobs soon.
Oh, okay.
In like 2017, maybe 2018. I'd be lying to if I told you that, oh yes, this is clearly what happened. My understanding is like I'm finding out now that people really like one of my papers. I didn't get the sense that this was something that was true.
Oh.
I didn't feel like there was this is the paper.
Yeah.
I didn't perceive it as more influential than others. But I do feel that the feeling that I got is that I, either through conversation with people at conferences or through maybe what my advisor said about me, I don't know, people started viewing me as like, oh, okay, you're part of the community now. You're sort of ready to graduate and we're considering you one of ours. That's more when I got this impression of like, okay, I'm established, more than through papers, because it never felt like my paper list was particularly impressive.
Interesting. Though I guess I don't know anyone who, I feel like everyone has this opinion of like, like my papers are just my papers. Like they're not, nothing special.
It's also very hard to get kind of like immediate feedback on papers. Like the delay is so long. I mean, maybe it's a little bit less true in ML these days, but like, I submit a paper, it gets published like 6 months later. People read it like very slowly over that time. You hear about someone citing it like a year after that,
Yeah, ML's a bit. ML's kind of the opposite of like, I was reading a paper the other day that was published on the 2nd and it had 5 citations. So it's a bit of the opposite where like by the time it gets to the conference, it's like old news.
And in a lot of ways that sounds nice. I do feel like like by the time people are like reading my papers, I'm like, oh, that's like super old news. Like nice I'm no longer interested in that topic. And like, I've already done a bunch of stuff after that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that delay, like finding ways around it seems great.
Yeah. Yeah. Nice website. And maybe put the word ML in it, even if there's not, maybe that'll work.
Yeah. Have you felt the pressure to switch to machine learning research like so many colleagues have?
Come to the dark side?
Yes, for sure. I think my problem is that I will never be as good as my ML colleagues because I am starting from so far behind. It's also the case that you're going to continue to need data storage layer that scales for ML workloads. You're going to continue to need consensus for fault tolerance. You're going to continue to need all these things. And it doesn't necessarily feel like if everyone starts working on LLMs, even the people who are not, whose expertise is not in machine learning, like we're going to be missing out a lot on the stack. And so rather than try to play catch up and like fail to compete and publish bad research on that, I'd rather try and continue working on stuff that I think is still relevant, maybe less shiny, but, and, you know, stay aware of the stack as opposed to just ignore the stack and just switch.
Yeah.
And of course, like it's, for a while, blockchain was really hot, and I felt I was getting a lot of VC interest. Like I was getting, you know, VC calls every couple times a month.
Yeah.
The French consulate was kept talking to me because they were having a lot of people come to talk about blockchain. And then for the last year and a half, I've disappeared, both from the VCs and from the consulates, like who's who-less, because suddenly it's not cool.
Yeah.
It's also nice and quiet. Like it's still relevant enough, but you can also have time to think.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I want to have the pressure of like the every morning checking. I have a lot of respect for you guys.
Yeah.
But I'm not necessarily sure I want the pressure to publish.
You don't check every morning. you have a nice these are the days that I check the papers. But
what I am trying to do is like I actually use gym time to watch a bunch of ML lectures. Like I'm watching a Stanford one right now because I couldn't find the Berkeley one. To try and like still be able to have a conversation about it, even though I'm doing research on it.
Yeah.
Not sure I've successfully developed a good understanding of it, at least try.
Yeah. But to what extent, when you're picking research problems to work on, or like research directions, how much do you weigh like just like, oh, I'm really curious about this thing versus like I have a hunch that this like could be like important in some sense thing here, or like an area that people haven't explored before versus like current major trends in industry or in like computer science at large, trends in funding. I don't know.
I'm picking research topics.
Okay, yeah, there's that too.
I think honestly that's been the biggest realization, is that I'm not picking research topics. The people I work with are. And what they're interested in is I can influence it. But it's actually really hard to, so if you give someone their initial project, but beyond that, it's actually really hard to control what people are interested in. I do think I'm starting to appreciate that it is hard to jump in an area that you find interesting without at least some link to your old area. The reason I got into consensus is because, or even privacy, always comes back to transactions. If I start doing something that is completely different, it's a little scary.
Yeah.
And being wrong is somewhat terrifying. I haven't really worried about trends in funding, to be honest. I don't want a large enough group that so far funding has been an issue. Also, we're not like systems are still funded at a really relatively fine rate if you want like a reasonably sized group.
Yeah. Do you feel like that's true kind of across systems research in American academia, or like obviously like maybe things are different at a big school like Berkeley?
I think the grant reviewers are often going to be quite lazy is the wrong word, but the more well-known the school, the more likely it is that you'll get funding, I think is a oversimplification, but probably has a solid amount of grain of truth. And I speak from a position of privilege that might not be true if I was at a school that was smaller or less established in that particular area.
Do you think that so do you think that there's a fair amount of this like top school privilege when it comes to like hiring in academia. Like something I notice is many people who become Berkeley professors or MIT professors come from like one of 5 schools, at least in machine learning. And it's just sort of a nice little transfer between like Stanford, Berkeley, MIT, like CMU.
So when I had to reapply, like because I wasn't officially admitted to Texas, I had to reapply, and my advisor was like, "Look, I want you to apply everywhere, like to a bunch of other schools, and I want you to come to Texas, but I want to fight for you." And I really appreciate him too. So I applied to a bunch of other places, and I had the opportunity to go to MIT and stuff, but they weren't doing the research that I liked. And to this day, the best decision I made was not to go to PDOS, but to stay at Texas, even though it looked less prestigious. I think there is a lot of elitism because I think people were very surprised by that decision. And I think when I in turn interviewed, or like when I moved to Cornell, some people were so lucky your advisor moved, it allows you to study at the best school. Like, what? Or even here, when I was interviewing, people would talk about the top 3. People talk about top 3, and then if you go to CMU, they'll talk about the top 4. If you go to UW, they'll talk about the top 5 as if it were a thing. There's definitely some elitism because I think in recommendation letters, people will say, well, they're the best in X that I've seen. And if your pool is viewed as weaker, it is a more difficult like claim to make. I do think that if you look at who we've hired at Berkeley recently, there's actually quite a wide variety of schools. So my year, I went to Texas. So I say Texas/Cornell. There was someone from UMD, Maryland. One person who was from Berkeley but did the majority of her PhD at UW. And I'm blanking on where the other 2 people went. So, we've hired a lot of Cornell PhDs, for example, over the years. I think the strongest American students will probably end up going to the strongest ranked schools, bar exceptions if they want to do something specific. So it does make sense that there's a correlation. Where I think it changes is that there are a lot of other countries that don't do research in undergrad, for example. Or if you went to a liberal arts school and you didn't get the chance to do research, and those people tend to often be equally as good as the people who looked like the top when they applied. And so those may go to schools that don't get the like cream of the crop US students. And I think those tend to be the people who will then go on the academic job market and do extremely well. So I think the CV matters more, like in the top schools, and I'll say top very broadly defined. I think is if your advisor is well established in the community, then your school has a big group that is broadly speaking well established in the community, you'll be there will be some elitism, but I think you'll be okay if you make it up with your CV. Even if people are a little, I think it drops off quickly. Like there's a threshold, I think, at which where people might be very surprised. I don't know if there's a particular number, right? But I think it does drop off. But I think as long as you're part of a group with lots of people who are established, I also think it's changing. Like departments, like there's a lot of departments that are growing and over the years have recruited extremely aggressively, like really top people. And so I suspect that as things are growing, there's not enough space for all the top people at pick your favorite school.
Right.
And so they'll go to the school that's maybe slightly lower ranked, but suddenly that school is no longer lower ranked. Like I'll pick a couple of schools in my head and then I'll be like, okay, I want to be in this place. So I think it's also changing in terms of maybe it's becoming less of a all boys club.
Yeah. That makes sense.
It exists though.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much of it is also just like, part of me thinks that some of this is top down, meaning like a lot of people who are professors, maybe got their professorship like a couple decades ago, seem to overwhelmingly be from these like top schools. And it seems like they have a fair amount of connections there. What's, one of the predominant reasons why you would hire someone or like have someone as your grad student, their advisor. So maybe it's just like, if everyone's coming from the same place and they know, they get a personal recommendation they know because it's from the same place.
I'm actually willing to think that undergrad, especially, like, it is probably harder to get admitted at Berkeley as an undergrad who did not go to the top X schools than as faculty. Because as faculty, I think you have the opportunity of attending, as long as you've attended the same conferences,
right?
You've been able to make a name for yourself, and if you've published the right papers, you can make a name for yourself. Whereas as an undergrad, if you did research with the right person, who says you're the best, then it's actually relatively easy to get in. But it's virtually impossible if you come from a place that didn't do research in undergrad.
Yeah.
So you mentioned like choosing a grad school. What would your more general advice be to people thinking about, what aspects they should consider in choosing a grad school for the PhD?
Pick a place where there's more than one person that you want to work with. Fault tolerance is a thing. I think I'd say if you feel like you get on well with your advisor and their grad students have wound up doing things that you want to do, whether it's they've all ended up in like creating startups, or they've all ended up doing well in industry, or they've all ended up in like good US schools, like pick a place where and not just the best PhD student, but the weakest as well. Like try and look at trends, not just the top N, look at the average N and the median N or whatever. And that might be different from different people, right? You might want to go to grad school because you want to create a startup. That probably influences your choice of advisor.
Yeah.
And I think beyond that, pick a group whose research you like. I will tell this piece of advice to everyone. I got this when I was having to figure out how to change advisors, and I worked on consistency. And as you know, a lot of it happens in PL, a lot of it happens in systems. And there were a couple of people who were interested in working with me in the PL world. And I could have done what I was doing in PL. But when I looked at the other papers, I thought they were kind of boring. Whereas when I looked at the other systems papers, I found them interesting. And so they were saying, well, you're going to work 80% or 70% of your time on your PhD, but the 30% are going to be seminars, reading groups, conversations with people. And that defines your community. So you can be doing the same research in a PL group versus in a systems group. What do you find interesting? And that was a really, really useful piece of advice.
Yeah.
The one I've continued applying, I think. Because the other people around you actually shapes your PhD pretty significantly.
Yeah. As we're coming up, I guess slightly past the hour, any parting words of wisdom to current grad students or incoming professors?
It's not the end all be all. It's not like graduating or not graduating college where it does have an impact. So I think we should try and do what we enjoy. And it's not the end of the world if it doesn't work out. We can just move on to the next job, whatever that may be. That sounds very pessimistic.
Yeah, it's real. It's probably pretty good advice.
I think at the end of the day, it's a job. And if we treat it as such, it helps resolve a lot of the pressure that we put ourselves through.
Yeah.
Both as PhD students and as faculty.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for doing this. It's fun.
Yeah.